Perhaps one figure I want us to start talking about is that of the chairperson of Steinhoff. I mean, here is a person who was so well respected in South African business circles. Yet, I mean, as I was going through the book, the guy knows nothing. It has to be one of the most intriguing parts of this whole saga.
It was part of the reason I started, I suppose, researching and writing this book. There are many figures that served on that board of Steinhoff, including Dr. Vuyo, who was the chairman at the time of this meltdown, who are very prominent, very well-known, very successful business people in their own right. And seemingly this kind of hit them out of the blue as well. So certainly there's there were some questions to be asked, and I had the opportunity as part of the book to do some very good interviews with Dr. Vuyo on the record. So there's a lot of it in the book as to his thinking, and I'll give 2 points, which remains interesting to me to perhaps provide some context and thinking as to how this could have happened. You've got a 76-year-old guy who's trying to consolidate his holdings in one group. You've got a very successful CEO, Markus Jooste, who for decades has seen driven the share price of this company through the roof. In the 5-year period to 2016, the share price grew 300%. I think to a large extent, the success story of that share price just keeping increasing and the auditors keeping signing off the books, to a large extent that made a lot of other people not ask too many difficult questions. When it comes to the directors, the important thing to note about Steinhoff, which makes it unique, is the board structure. It's the only company in the country who operates with a 2-tier board structure. So you've got one
Typical
board
of the German way of doing it.
Yeah, and interestingly, for those who might remember, the Volkswagen emissions scandal, that had similarities with the Steinhoff scandal, and it had a similar board structure. We've got a management board team of 2 or 3 individuals. In this case, Markus Jooste was the CEO, and you've got the larger supervisory board, and the management board tends to report to the supervisory board. So there's going to be questions as to what was communicated, what was not communicated. Some board directors are on record as stating that we were lied to, we were misled, information we asked was not forthcoming, etc. With regards to Dr. Vuyo, there's 2 points which is interesting. He's mentioned it himself quite often. Why would I put 60 billion rand of my own money into a company if there's a problem with it? And up to the end, he kept buying shares. He was kept investing in the company. So that's a convincing argument in one sense.
But it's not a convincing argument when you start looking at some of the things that he would have been involved in. Let's take, for example, the beginning of December 2015, when Steinhoff has to list in Frankfurt, right? Yes. I mean, Jooste waxes lyrical about how this is a milestone,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Yet, I mean, and what it's going to do for the company, yeah, and how that has been in the making for 7 years, yes, right? Yet the blue-eyed boy, the golden boy, who has to now see the fruits of his labor, is not there on this very important day.
Well, probably and because they had this
is there, representing Steinhoff. So clearly there's something he knew there, because, of course, it was shortly after he had heard that the Germans were investigating him for fraud.
It's a fascinating story, Vuyo. One point, Vuyo was not chairman at that stage. Vuyo only became chairman in May 2016. So he was only chairman for about a year and a few months. Okay, that's one point. The other point is, which is interesting, as you mentioned, only weeks after the raid in Germany, Mr. Jooste suddenly does not attend the biggest event in his company's career, which is the listing in Germany. Another interesting point which links to that 2015 situation, which is going to be a big problem, jurisdiction. Who is in charge of investigating, prosecuting this whole mess? And I'll tell you why. Steinhoff is not a South African company. It is a Dutch company. It is registered in Amsterdam. Its primary listing is in Germany. It's only got a secondary, smaller listing in South Africa. So who's in charge of this case? It's a jurisdictional disaster at the moment. The second point I wanted to make about Dr. Vuyo, and your point is valid, and there's questions that have to be asked. But there's another important point, I think, which is interesting when you look at his track record, and that's why a lot of these people speak about having faith in the leadership and trust. And if you look at his track record at Shoprite Checkers, for years it's been very well known that Whitey Bosson ran Shoprite and Dr. Vuyo let him run it, didn't get involved in the business. Why would that not be the same case here? You've got a very successful CEO, share price goes through the roof for decades. Why does he not say, well, I'm not going to interfere with the business, let the guy who knows what he's doing keep running the business? It's just an interesting theory.
Well, what's also interesting coming to Markus Jooste himself, something I find particularly interesting again following around the German listing episode. He is no longer now this sort of haughty genius who tells everyone, or at least behaves as such, that, I'm the guy who has made it all happening. Suddenly he says, I've got 100,000 employees all over the world. I've got 110 executives who run these businesses autonomously. But to me, that suggests that he was now aware that people had begun to see through his nonsense.
It's an interesting take. I don't necessarily completely agree. I think that still was speaking to his haughtiness, trying to say how big and impressive we are, and we've got so many people and employees, etc., etc. And we are because if you look at some of the actions he took after 2015, those were actions taken by someone who was still very much trying to act as if there was nothing wrong. Taking over Mattress Firm, which is where's kind of the big snowball, waterfall over the cliff event. Why does this company, why does Markus Jooste, who is the main driver of making these deals, go to America, buy a mattress company, paying $64 a share when the value of that share is only $29? It was insane, 115% premium. And that tipped off Viceroy, who, as you know, compiled a big report that they dropped into everyone's lap on the 6th of December, 2 days after Jooste resigned. And that led to this entire meltdown of this company. So interesting things that happened.
Which brings us to this question, a question, of course, everyone has been asking, which you also, ask in the book and attempt to answer. How did analysts, the JSE, investors, asset managers, directors overlook all the signs which, as you correctly observe in the book, were big and there for everyone to see?
So I think there's two main reasons that I can try and understand. And this Plurry's still got a long way to go. Two things that I'm trying to make out of that. Point one, the share price kept going through the roof, so things were going well, and the auditors kept signing off. So there was no, all the fundamentals looked great. So there was no real reason to question it deeper. And the second point, which is interesting, and I asked multiple members of the board, ex and former, the following question. I said, these warning signs here that we are aware now, in hindsight, for me, it's quite a big warning sign. I mean, you have a tax rate of effective tax rates of 12, 11%. How did you guys not ask bigger questions? You have this raid in Germany. How did you not, as a board, come together and ask the big questions? How did you miss this? And they said we didn't miss it. And in fact, we got independent, international, reputable, highly reputable organizations to investigate those allegations. And you know what they said? They said they came back to us, to the board meetings, with signed-off reports saying there is nothing wrong in this issue that you asked us to look at. So they are sitting on those reports, and that's going to be dropping when I'm sure the court cases go forward. It's going to make for some very, very interesting reading to see who those companies were who said there's nothing wrong at Steinhoff.
Lastly, very, very briefly, in that resignation letter that he wrote to staff, he said none of the members of his team, the COO, the CFO, Group Treasury and Finance had anything to do with what he calls his mistakes. Having done the research you had to do, compiling the book, and having listened to some of the things that have emerged recently, do you believe that?
I don't think it's possible for one person to do what seems to have been a manipulation of a large extent across more than 700 companies, 33 countries. So there's going to be a lot. I think there's certainly some things that I point to that people can look at more closely. I certainly do not think that this was the machinations of one person. And just a very last point, when you read that letter, it's going to be very interesting. I do not think that I think he's going to say that letter does not say I did anything illegal. Go look at it very closely. He's going to say I made mistakes as a CEO. I shouldn't have bought Mattress Firm. I'm very sorry. That's why I resigned.
James, thank you very much for coming through. He is, of course, the author of this book, Steinhoff, Inside South Africa's Biggest Corporate Crash. It's available at all the good bookstores.